Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. So it seems we are all here. So good afternoon again and welcome from me and from Claudia Stancati. We are very pleased to see you today connected on Zoom. And finally, we can resume our work that was interrupted in April 2019. As you know, we should have seen each other last year, but coronavirus pandemic prevented our annual meeting. As you know, I speak of annual appointment because the philosophy after artificial intelligence is now in its third edition. And I will not go into the merits of our philosophy after artificial intelligence symposium because I think I will take a little space at the end of our meeting during the closing remarks. And I want to start the conference, our symposium, following the program we have sent to you. But however, I must tell you that the program has undergone some changes in the last few days. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, Arthur Sullivan and Rafal Kur will not be able to attend our session. We waited until the end before giving you this news to see if our two colleagues could participate. But unfortunately, although both Arthur and Rafal are in remission, the coronavirus hangover does not allow them to participate. Arthur Sullivan, however, Arthur Sullivan had managed to give us an article, and I'll say a few words during the closing remarks about his research. Well, I don't know if Claudia Stancati want to welcome you and to say something.
No, I would prefer to be in London. 2 years ago, Caterina, we were in Farmhouse with me, I am sure. This was better. Another word. Another word, but we hope the next edition of symposium to be everywhere in UK without virus, and we start.
Well, so following our program, I now turn to Jonas Bosenhard. I hope I've pronounced this quite good. Okay, so Jonas is currently doing a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. His dissertation focuses on creativity and artificial intelligence. Prior to his doctoral studies, he studied at the University of Tübingen and the University of Oxford. Further areas of research, besides the philosophy of artificial intelligence and creativity, are AI ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophy of mind. Moreover, he is part of the leadership team of the Oxford Artificial Intelligence Society, where he is head of the events and media team. The title of his contribution is Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Philosophy, Philosophy and the Future of Artificial Intelligence. Please, Jonas.
Okay, yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for the introduction and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. And thank you all for tuning into my presentation. So only a couple of days ago, I came across this blog post, which raises a question I've been thinking about for a while now, namely how much philosophy will computers do in the future? And obviously this whole debate is still very new and niche, and it's still widely unexplored in what way AI might transform the way of doing philosophy in the future. So in my presentation, I would like to discuss the value AI might have for the future of philosophy. And in this context, I will outline different visions of what a philosophy after AI might look like. And of course, that's quite speculative because it's impossible to accurately predict the future, even when it comes to the further course of philosophy. But my analysis will be based on influential meta-philosophical conceptions of the present, that is, on widespread views on the nature of philosophical research prevalent today. So the whole story I would like to tell will hopefully not be too speculative. And if there will be some time left at the end, I will also briefly touch on the question of what value philosophy and particularly ethics might have for AI in the future. And these questions I just raised remind me of a similar debate in the late 19th century, which revolved around one of the most pressing academic issues of the time, namely the question of how to methodologically conduct historical research and scholarship. And arguably the most famous contribution to this debate came from none other than Friedrich Nietzsche in his book Untimely Meditations, in which he examines the life and future related value of studying history. And in this text, Nietzsche differentiates between three kinds of looking at the past, and in philosophical circles, these concepts are quite influential. So the first stance on the past or history is the monumental stance, which idealizes eminent and powerful and highly talented historical figures and draws inspiration from their lives and deeds. The second one, the antiquarian stance, in contrast, is characterized by a preserving and traditionalist way of dealing with the past, and often goes hand in hand with a kind of scholarly immersion in bygone periods. And last but not least, the critical stance, which radically breaks with the past and all things historical. Now you might wonder, why am I telling you these things about historiography and the like? Because in the following, I will use these Nietzschean terms as a source of inspiration to tackle the questions I outlined at the beginning. So let's imagine for a second Nietzsche was alive today and he reads about AI-driven philosophy online, and now starts to think about the value AI might have for philosophy. So since the inception of AI, there have been many successful and truly astonishing attempts to automate certain aspects of human reasoning. Think, for example, of the logic theorist, one of the first AI systems ever developed, namely in the 1950s already. And today, in many of the natural sciences, people and scientists use AI quite widely, and ever since DeepMind released AlphaFold just a couple of months ago, many scientists are convinced that AI will also revolutionize their scientific discipline. And also consider other areas, intellectual fields in which AI has dethroned humanity, so to speak. For example, when it comes to chess or the ancient game of Go more recently. So the obvious question that comes to mind now is, why shouldn't the same thing also happen to philosophy? And indeed, there are some transhumanist philosophers like Mark Walker or Philippe Verdoux who are convinced that this is not just science fiction, but can become reality soon. And this is also the way to go. Verdoux, for example, writes, progress in philosophy has been impeded in part by constraints imposed on us by the natural architecture of our cognitive systems. These constraints, though, could in principle be overcome by certain cognitive technologies. And I think it's fair to call this perspective monumental or monumentalist, so to speak, because while a person with a monumental take on history tends to exceptional historical individuals as guides for how to lead a life of greatness, a philosopher with a monumental stance on AI appeals to cognitive technologies as guides for the future of their discipline. In brief, as you can see here, the monumentalists put AI on a pedestal. And this might sound like science fiction, of course, yet maybe the first monumentalist ever was none other than Leibniz, who also already tried to automate philosophy and had similar visions of the future of the field. However, unsurprisingly, many philosophers are and probably will be more skeptical of the philosophical potential of AI and try to take AI from its pedestal. Some of them might argue along technology-related lines. They might, for instance, claim that the monumentalists fall prey to the current hype surrounding AI, and they might point to the fact that AI research went through a couple of AI winters already, and even though we might be in the midst of an AI summer currently, that doesn't mean that there are other AI winters to come. Other more critical philosophers might refer to Roger Penrose, who famously draws on Gödel's incompleteness theorem to argue that it's impossible for computers to simulate human intelligence. Other philosophers, in contrast, might challenge the monumentalist picture on philosophical or metaphilosophical grounds, because the monumentalists mentioned above, they all tacitly assume that philosophy is identical with truth seeking, so to speak, or theory building. Philosophy is just about gaining knowledge and coming up with theories about philosophically interesting phenomena. Yet there are influential metaphilosophical accounts and conceptions that cast critical light on that assumption. Heideggerians or existentialists, for instance, take the exploration of the human condition, of human existence, as it were, as the focal point of philosophy. Similar to that, Wittgensteinians and therapeutic philosophers think that philosophy shouldn't be all about making positive propositions, but about offering intellectual therapies for conceptual confusions. And besides that, Marxist philosophers, critical theorists, post-colonial thinkers, and feminist philosophers might, in addition, argue that philosophy shouldn't only try to describe reality, but should actually try to change and challenge the political and social status quo, the political and social reality. And what all of these meta-philosophies listed here have in common is that they view philosophy as deeply intertwined with the human form of life, and they criticize the monumentalist stance for neglecting this connection, so to speak. However, against these meta-philosophical pictures, it might be argued that in fact, AI will become and has already started to become an important part of the human form of life. AI already starts to shape the human form of life, what it means to be human, and has a crucial impact on social and political processes and structures. And there is a third group of philosophers, maybe already now, but also in the future, in my opinion. And unsurprisingly, they take an anti-Quarian stance, as it were, and they take this objection to the metaphilosophical objection I just raised seriously. For Nietzsche, anti-Quarian historians historicize everything, and similar to that, anti-Quarian philosophers, as it were, historicize all of philosophy, and the anti-Quarian idea manifests itself, in my opinion, in what Foucault calls the historical a priori. According to Foucault, the historical a priori is the precondition, incorporates the preconditions of all ideas and beliefs of a historical period, and thus the historical a priori shapes how and what people think at a certain point in time. And the German philosopher and media theorist Friedrich Kittler takes this even one step further and argues that or interprets Foucault's historical a priori in technological terms and speaks of a technological a priori. And he argues that the technology of a time always determines what ideas can come up and what kind of theories can be developed at a certain point in time. And Marshall McLuhan also points in a similar direction when he famously states that we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Now, such antiquarian thinkers might argue that AI, due to its pervasiveness and power, will form a new historical or technological a priori and thus shape how we think and philosophize in the future. Yet, unlike the monumentalists, the antiquarian philosophers would not render this as progress or the right way of doing philosophy. From their perspective, it's not possible to rank various meta-philosophies or philosophical theories in terms of truthfulness, because for them, there's no meta level available from which these different approaches could be compared and evaluated. Because for them, for the antiquarians, every philosophy only makes sense against the backdrop of the historical context it is part of. And many philosophers already today are kind of skeptical about this historicistic approach, particularly when they have more systematic ambitions. And in addition to that, what is also problematic about the antiquarian stance, it's that it implies a kind of technological determinism, which undermines human agency and autonomy, because according to this picture, human thought and action is already totally determined by technology. And that's quite a big assumption, in my opinion, and can be criticized. So the obvious question now is, which of the three stances and approaches and perspectives outlined is the most fruitful and adequate one? And as we have seen, all of these stances face some serious limitations, so it's worth consulting Nietzsche again. Nietzsche himself did not prioritize one of the three perspectives on history he presents. Rather, he is convinced that, or he thinks that an equilibrium between these three perspectives is ideal. And I think the same can be said about the three stances on AI in the context of future philosophy. So in contrast to the three stances I outlined, I would like to suggest another metaphor or picture which retains the best features of the three stances outlined, but overcomes their shortcomings. And there are two assumptions I make here. First, in line with Wittgensteinians and the Heideggerians and critical theorists, I regard philosophy as a deeply human enterprise and thus as linked to the human form of life. And of course, one might argue that, it's imaginable that post-human beings will also discuss philosophical questions, yet due to the difference in form of life, it's also easily imaginable that their discussions, arguments, questions, and answer will take a radically different form. Nonetheless, I accept that AI has, as the antiquarians claim, has an impact on the human form of life, but AI will never fully determine the human condition, in my opinion. Otherwise, we will stop being humans, I guess. And secondly, I embrace meta-philosophical pluralism. So I think philosophy is not exclusively about truth-seeking, theory-building therapy, or political and social critique, or something else, but comprises all of these elements. All of these things have, in my opinion, their rightful place in the practice of philosophy. So on this basis, I would like to suggest another metaphor to challenge the three stances, which are taken by themselves flawed. In my opinion, in the philosophical context, we best think of AI as a tool, or even better, as a toolbox, because a tool is embedded in the form of life. Think, for example, of a hammer. One needs a hand with a human opposable thumb, so to speak, to use a hammer. Moreover, a tool can help us to gain knowledge, but doesn't replace us humans, since it has always to be used by a human to gain knowledge, as it were. It doesn't gain knowledge by itself. Moreover, a tool can be used for different ends. Besides that, it can not only serve as a means to gain knowledge, but also as a means to bring about social change, for example, and many other things. Furthermore, a tool can be criticized and improved. And in addition to that, tools shape how we think and act. but they do not leave us completely powerless, since using them presupposes human agency and some sort of autonomy. And last but not least, tools create value. So do we still have a couple of minutes? Then I would also say something about touch on the second question. Is it okay? Yeah.
Yes, it is, please.
Great,
Go
thanks.
ahead.
Thanks. So also briefly, I would like to touch on the value philosophy might have for the future of AI. And as you probably know, in the early days of AI searchers were often very critical of philosophical interventions in their field. They had a critical stance on philosophy or philosophical interventions, so to speak. One only has to think of Hubert Dreyfus and his Heidegger-inspired critique of traditional, symbolic, and also the hostile and harsh reactions his critique provoked. Yet over the years, it turned out that many of the points of criticism Dreyfus raised were actually accurate. For example, his thoughts on the role of embodiment when it comes to intelligent behavior. Furthermore, over the last couple of years, AI ethics has become a hot topic, and philosophers have played a key role in this conversation from the very beginning, and they have started to analyze and raise awareness for the ethical implications of AIs. Here are two of the big names in the field, Floridi and Bostrom. And so over the last couple of years, the expectations directed towards AI philosophy and AI ethics have become fairly high. There's a lot of money put into AI ethics research, and there are AI ethics institutes popping up all over the world with many philosophers working there. Moreover, some AI researchers, like none other than David Deutsch, for instance, even think that philosophy will play a key role when it comes to the future technological evolution of AI itself, particularly when it comes to the quest for general artificial intelligence. He writes, philosophy will be the key that unlocks AI. So in other words, there are today huge, or as it were, monumental expectations directed towards philosophy. Now, however, antiquarians again might argue that philosophy will fail to live up to these expectations, and they might try to make that point by highlighting that there is in basically all subdisciplines within philosophy a lot of disagreement. David Deutsch, for instance, thinks that you need a good philosophical theory of consciousness to be in the position to develop general artificial intelligence. Now, however, if you take a look into the philosophy of consciousness, there are many opposing theories. Here you can see just a couple of them. Moreover, the same problem when it comes to the trolley problem, which is, as you know, one of the key issues when it comes to self-driving cars. A Kantian philosopher will approach and respond to the trolley problem quite differently than, say, a utilitarian philosopher. So again, all of these three stances I just outlined exhibit shortcomings. The expectations are either too high or too low. And therefore, I would like to like to suggest an alternative picture, but this time when it comes to the role philosophy should play in AI. And in my opinion, philosophy shouldn't be viewed as an oracle or something that can or should be ignored. Rather, it should be regarded as a discussion partner, because a discussion partner opens up new perspectives and gives advice. Discussion partners sometimes disagree, but also sometimes agree, but also sometimes disagree and contradict and challenge each other. And the contributions of a discussion partner should ideally be taken seriously, but they are not absolutely authoritative. For otherwise, it wouldn't be a discussion, but an instruction or a lecture. Moreover, the discussion shouldn't only be restricted to AI and philosophy. It shouldn't only be a dialogue. There should be various other discussion partners, for instance, statistics, neuroscience, biology, psychology, and many other disciplines, you name it, just to have a wide variety of different ideas and perspectives. And in my opinion, this diversity will hopefully eventually lead to progress in the field of AI, to better and more ethical AI systems. Here are the references. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I think we can listen to Caterina Moruzzi's talk and then have and then open the discussion about these two talks. Then we should have 10 minutes break. Then we will restart with another session. And I think at the end we can have time and space for a more general discussion. If you agree, we can follow this path. So I now turn to Caterina Moruzzi. Caterina is a research assistant at the Department of Philosophy, Università Constance. Her research addresses topics in aesthetics and philosophy of mind, with a particular emphasis on issues concerning creativity, artificial intelligence, and the ontology of music. Her talk is on the relevance of understanding for creativity. Caterina, please.
Thanks, Giusy. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. Right. Good. So, as Giusy was saying, today I'm going to talk about two concepts, understanding and creativity. I'm going to talk about the relation between these two concepts, which have received a lot of attention in the literature, taken individually, but whose connection has been rarely addressed. And I will aim to bridge, at least in part, this gap and to argue for the relevance of understanding for creative processes. So I will start by providing a definition of what understanding is by focusing on four crucial aspects of understanding. And I will then claim that for creativity, two kinds of understanding are relevant, namely recipient and what I will call recipient and agent understanding. And I will then argue that alongside the necessary care that is devoted toward the development of machines capable of understanding, we should also place some attention also toward the reception of the performance of these machines. And I close the talk by briefly sketching the neurosymbolic AI program, and I will say why I think it is one of the most promising AI programs to develop machines capable of a deeper and context-sensitive understanding. So understanding can be enumerated among what Marvin Minsky called suitcase words, so words that contain a variety of different meanings, such as other terms like learning and intelligence. And the term understanding is indeed a compound of different notions and concepts. And there are four notions that I think can help us in having a more thorough vision of the nature of understanding. And these notions will be relevant also for the discussion on the relation between understanding and creativity later on. So these four notions are knowledge, grasp, problem solving, and context sensitivity. So the view that understanding is a form of knowledge is prevalent in the literature. And like knowledge, understanding is a cognitive achievement or a success that can be ascribed to an agent. To many, however, understanding seems to be more demanding than knowledge. And in order to understand, it is not enough to know, but an additional component is needed, which can be identified with the concept of grasp. And grasping a previously unknown connection between two elements or facts is accompanied by a revelation moment that much has in common with a creative process. Indeed, a key component of creativity is the act of building connections between unrelated fields with the aim of reaching a successful conclusion of the problem-solving task that is part of the creative process itself. And so this introduces the next concept, problem-solving. problem-solving processes consist in the exploration and analysis of the different paths that can be taken in finding a solution to the problem. And a competent problem solver needs not only to have a grasp of the relevant connections between the pieces of information provided, but also to articulate their dependency and the causal relations. And within this problem-solving process, context sensitivity is another key component. Indeed, the consideration of the context of action is an essential element in the evaluation of whether an agent completes the task successfully or not. And thus, context sensitivity, I think, is another relevant notion for the concept of understanding. And this will prove to be a key point in the consideration of how understanding is a notion that lies on a spectrum, so we can have more or less understanding, and also on how state-of-the-art AI fares in respect to understanding itself. So I come now to the relation between these two concepts, understanding and creativity. And in particular, as I mentioned at the beginning, I will identify two kinds of understanding, recipient and agent understanding. And I will argue that both of these kinds of understanding are necessary for creativity. So let's start with recipient understanding. So the understanding of the receiver is necessary for a process to be recognized as creative. And in her famous work on creativity, Margaret Boden identifies three dimensions of creativity, which are combinatorial, exploratory, and transformational creativity. And transformational creativity is the most extreme and challenging kind of creativity of the three. And the challenge resides in finding a balance between too little and too much novelty in the creative process that is being undertaken. So if it is not novel enough, then it does not comply with the necessary requirements for creativity. But at the same time, if it is too novel, it runs the risk of not being deemed creative, as it cannot be understood by recipients in this case. So how does AI fare in respect to this kind of understanding, in respect to recipient understanding? So in 2019, I conducted, when I was still at the University of Nottingham, a survey on the perception of human and artificial creativity in the artistic domain. And the results that we obtained revealed a strong opposition against creative AI, since respondents felt that the incursion of AI into a field that is paradigmatically human, such as creativity, was improbable, but also they rejected it with determination. And this opposition against creative AI has been reported also elsewhere in the literature, it was not just the result of our survey. And just to stick to the results that we obtained, the majority of replies given by participants to this survey expressed skepticism about the possibility for AI to become creative, since they believe that AI lacks experience, contextual knowledge, flexibility, intentionality, self-evaluation, and other marks of the human nature, basically. So even if the results of this survey cannot be considered, of course, conclusive to answer the question of whether AI can have this kind of understanding, so recipient understanding, they are a starting point to begin a reflection on the challenge for artificial systems to reach this kind of understanding. The second kind of understanding is agent understanding. And so agent understanding is the kind of understanding that I think we normally think about when considering this notion. So when engaging in a creative process, an agent normally reflects on what she produces and tries to improve according not only to the feedback that she receives from the outside, which is part of the recipient understanding, but also to the inner feedback that an agent gives to herself. So understanding is a key part of this evaluative component, and it is crucial in the process of trial and error that is performed when considering whether the connections that are established during the creative process work or not. And these critical thinking stages usually referred to also as selective retention or as convergent thinking. And I will come back later on to convergent thinking in the context of the neurosymbolic program in AI. So also in the case of agent understanding, AI systems still seem to be far from obtaining it. And one of the models that is getting closer to achieving it are the creative adversarial networks. And these models, as I'm sure some of you know, consist of these two different neural networks, the generator and the discriminator, which are competing one against the other in order to originate new data instances. And this feedback loop between generator and discriminator can be interpreted as an evaluation process, which is in some ways analogous to the human process of trial and error that I was mentioning before. So unlike other models in AI that use human judges to evaluate the performance of the algorithm, in creative adversarial networks, the feedback mechanism happens within the system itself. And another field of AI that is very active in trying to develop systems capable of understanding is, of course, NLP, so natural language processing. And BERT and GPT-3 are two of the latest models. BERT was released in October 2019 by the Google AI team, and it is supposed to consistently improve the user's experience of browser search in English and in other languages, thanks to this increased responsiveness to the context of the query. So it processes words in relation to all the other words of the sentence, not just the adjacent words. And the latest one, so GPT-3, was released in 2020 by OpenAI. And the difference between GPT-3 and BERT is that GPT-3 learns from an even bigger data set. But I would argue that although having a quantitatively superior data set, it is not qualitatively superior to BERT in this respect. And the reason is that it still lacks context sensitivity and the sense of pragmatics. So in order to acquire understanding of utterances, syntax and semantics are not sufficient, because meaning is linked, as we know, also to pragmatic, so to the interaction with the environment and to a pragmatic understanding of language. And this is still something that AI systems arguably do not possess, even if they have a large data set on which they are trained. So in this concluding section, I will suggest that instead a very recent path in the AI research is promising for finding a solution to these weaknesses that I just mentioned. And this program is the neurosymbolic program. But before talking about it, we need to have a quick look at two of the major AI research paths that are the basis of this new program, which are symbolic AI and sub-symbolic AI. So symbolic AI, which is known also as good old-fashioned AI or rule-based AI, involves the explicit embedding of human knowledge and behavior rules into computer programs. And it is generally localist and discrete and includes planning and non-monotonic reasoning and reasoning by analogy as well. Sub-symbolic AI, on the other side, is also known as connectionism. And examples of sub-symbolic AI are neural networks and deep learning. And the origins of sub-symbolic AI come from the attempt to mimic the human brain and the complex neural network of the human brain. So in contrast to symbolic AI, sub-symbolic AI is not based on the manipulation of symbols to find solutions to problems, but instead on finding correlations between input and output variables. So far, the AI models that have been applied to creative tasks use mainly sub-symbolic techniques, since they grant programs the capacity to process a large amount of data and to find patterns within this large amount of data. But yet, subsymbolic AI has also some downsides. So it requires a huge amount of data and computational power, of course, and it is highly dependent on this training data and therefore prone to biases and difficult to interpret. On the other side, while symbolic AI is more explainable and capable of a higher level abstract knowledge in respect to subsymbolic AI, it is prone to noise, brittle, and also more computationally complex. So this new program, the Neurosymbolic AI program, has the aim of finding a solution to the weaknesses of both these systems by combining them together. And in the design of this state-of-the-art program, researchers have taken inspiration from Daniel Kahneman's dual theory of the human mind, developed in his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So for Kahneman, our mind processes can be distinguished in two kinds of processes, or what he calls systems. So system one is effortless, fast, and automatic, and it is the one that we use the majority of the time when interacting with the world. And it is, for example, the system that is activated when we do a simple operation like 2 + 2. System 2, on the other hand, is lower and more rational, and it is activated when we need to perform a task that requires our full attention, or when we are confronted with an unexpected situation. And for example, it is the system that is activated when we need to perform a more difficult operation like a complex multiplication. So the way system one works is analogous to the mechanisms of subsymbolic AI, with the ability to identify patterns and connections from a large variety of input data. Even if there are still processes that system one, our brain, can perform that instead current machine learning systems are incapable of, and I mentioned some of them. For example, the capacity of building causal connections and common sense reasoning. And on the other hand, system two's capacity to solve complex problems is more akin to AI techniques based on logic and planning, and that employ explicit knowledge and symbols like symbolic AI. So this division of tasks between symbolic and subsymbolic AI techniques and the dual system model proposed by Kahneman reflect the two dimensions present also in the creative process and described by Guilford as divergent and convergent thinking. So divergent thinking refers to the intuitive production of a large number of possible alternatives, and it is thus based on association between remote concepts, which is a key feature of creativity. And convergent thinking instead involves the construction of relevant connections between these alternatives and their examination in respect to their logical validity. So this second stage, convergent thinking, focuses on finding a solution through the application of pre-established rules. And for this reason, it is more similar to how system 2 and symbolic AI work. So to conclude, I argue that understanding is a necessary component for creativity. However, with understanding, I do not mean only agent understanding, which is the kind of understanding that we are mostly used to think about when referring to this notion, but also recipient understanding. So the perception that the observers have of the creative process itself. And in the field of AI, while the development of these hybrid systems like the Neurosymbolic AI program that combines symbolic and subsymbolic approaches to AI may be a way forward to develop creative capacity and agent understanding in artificial systems, there is still the need to work toward the achievement of recipient understanding. Because as we have seen, the acceptance of processes and products that are achieved by AI is dependent not only on the capabilities of the artificial systems themselves, but also in the attitude and the preconceptions that we as humans have when assessing their performance. And as we know, the notions of creativity and understanding are deeply interconnected with anthropic features. But this anthropocentric interpretation of these concepts could at the same time deter us from recognizing AI performance as a result of understanding and creativity, even when it could legitimately be deemed as such. And one way to avoid this consequence is to see whether it is possible to propose definitions of understanding and creativity that are not based on anthropomorphic features in order to avoid these disciplinary biases. That was it. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for your talk, Caterina. Well, I think we can open a 10 minutes debate, then we will have a short break, and then we will resume at 2 o'clock with Steve and Sonia. And at the end, we can have a huge, wide moment of general discussion, but we can start now with this 10 minutes debate. Then we can proceed with questions to Jonas and Caterina. I've seen before some raising hands.
Jonas, I think, no?
Okay, has someone questions for Caterina and Jonas? Okay, Steve. Steve,
Yeah,
yes, please.
I tried the raise hand button. I don't know if it came up.
Okay.
Yeah, my question was primarily for Caterina. So the good old-fashioned AI and the neurosymbolic approach seem to be the same in that they seem to regard symbols as emerging somewhere between input and output. So I wondered how you would compare that with kind of a more embodied approach to cognition, where you think of symbols as kind of emerging, or meaning emerges in the world. So symbols emerge in the world rather than in this narrow space in the brain between input and output.
Well, yeah, thanks. It's super interesting. Yes, I think that will be the challenge. So as I mentioned, this program is very recent. I think they started to talk about it in AAAI conference in 2020. So it's something that is really emerging now. But what they are discussing is also so this issue, so how to embed what I call the pragmatics, the pragmatic side of meaning into these artificial systems. And the way in which they're trying to do that is, again, through sensors and embodiment of these systems. I think this will be key to move on and to reach this context sensitivity that is necessary for achieving this kind of understanding. But I'm not sure how they will manage to do that, going beyond what you were mentioning, so going beyond this symbolic approach. So I can see there is the potential for doing it, but in order to achieve that, we will first need, I think, to achieve systems that are more autonomous in learning from the environment. So yes, I don't have a more specific or detailed answer to this, but yes, I think that will be one of the major challenges, because it's difficult in modeling a system to go beyond this symbolic approach, I guess.
Thank you, Caterina. Thank you, Steve. Now, Sonia, please.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Great.
Thank you both for your presentations. For Caterina, I have a lot of questions, so I think I will email you, because I think our research is very close from different angles. So you'll get an email from me.
Do that, yeah.
But maybe for Jonas, I was wondering near the end of the presentation, when you talked about sort of technological determinism, if we are following thinkers like McLuhan or Kidler, then there is not really a kind of dualism in the sense that it's us versus technology, but it's more like we are inherently technological. So there's not really like a determinism in that sense, because kind of tool use is our nature, and the sort of feedback mechanism between ourselves and our tools is what makes us human, right? So you mentioned a few times what makes us human and human agency. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on your perspective on that aspect of like what, you know, now we're in a philosophical context, so it's apt to ask those kind of questions like, what do you think makes us human?
I mean,
Thanks.
I'm not sure if I got your question right, but I think Kittler is quite radical when it comes to human agency and autonomy. He says it's an illusion. Autonomy is an illusion, and he's very explicit about that. And I think that's too radical. I'm not sure Marshall McLuhan might be a bit less radical there, but I think Kittler is very explicitly very radical on that front, I guess. So, yeah. And what makes us human, of course. I mean, I think there's no, I also wouldn't separate between the human on the one side and technology on the other side. Technology is important in the context of the human form of life. And that's part of one of my assumptions, actually. But I think just that technological determinism, Kittler, for instance, presents is too radical. We still have some kind of autonomy, but our autonomy is also limited by the technologies and tools we use. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, thanks. I was asking because indeed, like the loop in Kittler is that like we still are the ones who are producing this technology and like who are philosophizing about it. So there is a, you know, it's a kind of a wink in being so deterministic, technologically deterministic, to say that there is no autonomy because, you know, it is this kind of feedback loop. But thanks for your answer. Makes it clear.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Jonas. Are there any other questions for Sonia and Jonas? Oh, Jonas, please.
Yeah, thanks, Katerina. Super interesting. I have a question regarding causality, particularly when it comes to system 2 thinking and the symbolic AI. I mean, Julia Pearl, for instance, is quite enthusiastic about that causal approach to AI. Do you think that would be a useful addition to the merely symbolic approach when it comes to modeling or simulating logic-based reasoning, system 2 thinking?
Yes, I think so. I'm not completely familiar with that. I think that would be, since, as I mentioned, one of the things that is necessary, I think, to achieve this kind of understanding is finding causal, building these causal connections. I think so, but you may know more than me on this. Why do you think that it would be useful, especially in which sense? Do you think it is possible to combine that with a symbolic program?
Yeah, I think causality, getting an understanding of causal relations is important when it comes to logic-based reasoning. And I think old-fashioned AI, as it were, you don't get causal reasoning with that only. So I was just wondering if you've already started exploring that direction. Like
not, but I think that would be very promising, because as you were mentioning, probably what the sub-symbolic direction may add to this causal finding of causal connections is this kind of intuitive and embodied relation with the world that we have and that we can build into AI systems. So thanks for the suggestion, because yeah, that's something that be interesting to get to know more. Yeah.
Well, okay. Thank you very much. Now we will have a few minutes of break, and we will be here again at 2 o'clock. And we will have the talk of Sonia and Steve. Okay, so we will be here in a couple of minutes.
Great, thanks.
So, Giusy, has the...
So it seems we have time.
You've got the dog.
I think Claudia. I think it's Claudia's dog. And I will mute her microphone if I can. Oh, no. So it's not. Okay. Well, I think we should start. And so let's resume. Let's resume our session with the talk of Sonia and Steve. And so I now turn to Sonia. Sonia de Jager was born in Buenos Aires in 1988. He's currently a doctoral researcher at Erasmus University, and she's writing a thesis about the philosophy of artificial intelligence. She also works at the Wilhelm de Kooning Academy as an art theory tutor and runs the yearly music and philosophy conference, Regenerative Feedback. The title of her contribution is Inevitably Falling into Place, Intuition as a Function of Spatial Prediction. Sonia, please.
Thank you, Giusy, for the introduction. I don't really have slides. I only have 2 slides, and I will put them on at the end. It's for showing one image, so I will be basically reading. I hope. Can you maybe mute Claudia, because I still hear the dog.
I'm sorry, but I don't know why I can't mute her. I will try here.
Maybe she's coming back now, and then it will be okay. I can just get started otherwise. So yeah, this lecture is based on the eclectic paper that I sent in, and I titled the lecture a little bit different from the paper. So the lecture is what does falling have to do with thinking, have to do with computation? And it's mostly a collection of thoughts that I've been having about the spatial act of falling as a productive way of thinking about questions of a more metaphysical nature than we would generally ascribe to the simple act of falling. My intention is to shed some light on questions regarding what it means to exist in a world bounded by gravity and ultimately entropy, of course, where related concepts like autonomy, independence, and control are ultimately guided by these unavoidable principles. And I'm not presenting a discovery here, but I'm proposing a different metaphysical lens through the spatial-temporal act of falling. So what does falling have to do with thinking and computation? If you're a philosopher, everything has to do with everything, right? So, but let's unravel this. In the paper, I combine ideas from the fields of predictive processing and spatial reasoning to provide an account of intuition in order to show that what we call intuition is in fact very much on the same page as capital R rationality. So this would be Contra, Kahneman, and dual process theories. So that the two could even be said to be the same thing. This is in a way nothing new, as Spinoza already speculated about. These things can be considered as being on a spectrum. And it's crucial to think about this now for AI as one of the main projects out there, and sometimes rather naively structured projects, is the development of agents that possess so-called common sense, right? Or what John McCarthy called any fool's knowledge. And this is mostly done in spatial terms, as in, an agent knowing how an object will behave when it's picked up, but also in terms of natural language processing. So what is meant by common sense in AI is very close to what intuition is about colloquially, in the sense of, looking at a bunch of objects, then looking at a box, and then feeling whether the stuff will fit or not in that box. And as far as our phenomenological axis goes, we're not doing strict mathematical calculations when we do this. We're simply spatially predicting our way around. And we very often cannot even explain why we feel that. We just feel it, right? And this is the primary type of intuition that I'm referring to. So here we get to the first moment where falling relates to thinking, this more or less inevitable feeling, inevitable because, as I said, it happens to us rather than us diagrammatically understanding how we bring it about, is a spatial prediction. We are spatially predicting how something will behave and how we will behave in relation to it. And we are, so to speak, falling into the predictive thought. It happens to us. This happens internally, and it relates to your childhood encounters as you become a person. And this grows very slowly, of course, as you learn to move about through space and interact with objects. I think we can all agree that we develop this type of intuition as children before we develop anything like language or so-called rationality. things being molded, handled, stacked, moved, balanced, shuffled, etc. All of these activities thus lie at the basis of what we normally consider to be higher order cognitive tasks, like doing mathematical calculations or writing a philosophy paper, for example. So developing efficient ways for moving through space is the first and foremost evolutionary progression of almost all species, we could say. Agility, balance, speed, etc. But the actual first and foremost defining characteristic of what we considered life is that it separates itself off through a membrane enclosure from the rest of the world. So the genesis of the concept of life could even be considered, the genesis of the concept of space. And dealing with space is dealing with gravity, unintentionally falling, letting yourself fall ever so slightly, or avoiding a fall. What is walking if not a series of gravitational events where one continually falls forward? We are born into a universe bounded by gravity, and so our thoughts, we fall in love, things fall through the cracks, we fall to pieces, we rise and fall prey to something, we fall asleep, we fall behind, we fall through, we fall apart, we fall ill, or we fall silent. But let's not fall too deep into the poetic zone for the moment and go back to AI. So the algorithmic process method that is used for teaching neural networks how to teach themselves, so to speak, if I may put it so crassly, is the process of gradient descent. As we know, gradient descent is an optimization algorithm which has the goal of finding the easiest way around a function. So the easiest way ideally would be the generalization of a multidimensional space into useful interpretations for predictive processes for human purposes, right? And what we end up with are, for example, generative neural networks that can average stuff. You feed them a bunch of cat pictures, and after a while, they will be able to produce an average of a cat picture based on all the gradient descending that they've done with a data set of cat pictures. So following patterns, traveling the path of least resistance in a way is a way of falling, a way of thinking, a way of computing. And be mindful that I'm not saying these things are the same thing. I'm saying there is an interesting metaphysical comparison to be made. So what is interesting, very interesting in the context of AI is that a spatial analogy of somebody moving through space is one of the main examples that is used to explain gradient descent in a non-technical way. And the explanation goes like this. Let's say that someone is climbing up a mountain and suddenly the weather changes, it starts to get foggy, and there's suddenly a drastic reduction in visibility. Space becomes smaller, right? So the choices that one can make are limited. The person, if they want to get down, they need to rely on very little information, immediate information, in order to start descending. So looking left and right, finding the steepest paths to be able to get down as fast as possible, because imagine, I don't know, it's going to start raining. So literally by moving by stochastic steepest gradient descent, the person would eventually find their way down. Gradient descent in practice is mathematically more complex than this, but you get the point. The epistemologically interesting commentary about this is that for understanding to happen, for the grasping of this concept to happen, we need to employ a spatial metaphor. And I need to tell you how going down a mountain is comparable to gradient descent for you to understand how an algorithmic process that is inaccessible to you, experientially, how that actually happens. So thought unfolds spatially once more in more directions than one, literally and metaphorically speaking, which are obviously connected. So hopefully by now it will be clear a little bit about how falling and thinking and computation can be seen as related to each other, conceptually speaking, in this weird metaphysics of falling way. Agents process information in a predictive fashion. They need to have knowledge about what comes next in order to act upon the world. And here it's also important to mention as a side note that spontaneity and randomness are also crucial aspects of thinking, less predictive because they require that there is no knowledge about what comes next. But this is cognitively, creatively speaking, just as fundamentally important. And so perhaps we could say that intuition is a cognitive state where prediction is being attempted, but there is still quite a lot of uncertainty in the picture, like when we go down a foggy mountain, right? So this plastic faculty of intuiting one's way around emerges from the real life limitation of being born into a world of gravity. There is a certain resistance and negativity that needs to be overcome, and agents, overcome it by positively falling forward instead of neutrally staying put. This prediction is the connection between two or more spatial models. So the one or the ones that you are at, and the one or the ones that you want to be at. Intuitive prediction, what we do when we think and move, is driven by the combination and recombination of spatial speculations. And how is this connected with so-called higher order cognitive faculties like pure thought or language in isolation from spatial events? Well, first of all, I would say that nothing can be said to be isolated from spatial events, and this is one of the biggest shortcomings in most disciplines when it comes to what should be considered as thought. There's an inability to appreciate and see thought in action, and a big ass bias to only consider capital thought proper as happening exclusively in heads and books, and more recently computers. But this critique, we know, of course, it was mentioned already by one of the most famous ones by Marvin Minsky, of course. And this this inability to see the spatial aspect is very unfortunate, and has, for example, been one of the main reasons why manual labor is less remunerated than desk labor, or why all sorts of spatially based activities that leave no paper trail are not considered work. But this is another discussion. So thought proper, let's say that even at the level of abstract concepts originate spatially and slowly become contracted, summarized estimations. The establishment of a constant relation and reassociation of these summarized patterns resulting in conceptual cognition. Think about how you acquire concepts. Let's start with like a simple concept, for example, that of a truck. First, you probably learned about cars, and then after seeing a bunch of cars and suddenly seeing a truck, you understand that it's a sort of car, but not exactly. It has more space, it carries more stuff, and later on in life, when you hear someone say truckload, as in that lecture that Sonia gave was a truckload of garbage, you have never heard that expression, truckload, but you know what a truck is and that it carries big loads, and you understand immediately that we're talking about a lot of garbage. And later on, when you hear the expression again, you don't need to think about trucks or loads anymore. Just the word container, truckload, in your spatial configuration in relation with everything else that happened to you and that might be happening to you at that time, becomes a summary that quickly points you to an estimation of something being a lot, in this case, particularly aggressively so, because we know that trucks do heavy-duty work and carry large quantities of stuff. Additionally, the combination of the words garbage and truckload certainly reminds you of your experiences with both garbage and trucks, and we quickly understand that we're talking about a whole lot of crap. Another spatial expression which creates a thought based on your previous life experiences with the spatial stuff of crap. So memory arises as a way of dealing with current events, as a way of explaining our current state. This is what predictive processing says. Memory is not a window into the past, but a window into the present. So as predictive processing explains, the self creates a hallucination that needs to explain its current state to itself so that it may continue going about as a being, enclosed and coherent, right? Understanding that it can control itself. Otherwise, selfhood, subjectivity, perspective would not make sense. Organisms themselves would not make sense. They would not exist. Time then is, of course, just another spatial dimension, but we already know this. It's important to note that what we do with the concept of time is employ it spatially as the basis for our meaningful interaction with the world. And yeah, time is the sort of metaphoric base of anything that we do when we construct meaningful things and when we ask questions. So the way that we ask why questions is by looking for how one spatial event relates to another one. Why does my stomach hurt? Why am I asking myself that? These telescopic inquiries are ways of tying one spatial event to another one. Because I ate something that was actually rotten, or because I need to know the cause in order to find a solution. You're isolating and connecting spatial events that are of interest to you at that moment. And this reminds me of a Borges quote that I often bring up, which I owe to my father having pointed it out to me originally a very long time ago, but a current event in my head happening right now, where Borges says, it's a very short reference in one of the short stories. He says, imagine an inversion of time, a state in which we remember the future and know nothing or barely feel a presentiment of the past. So what would be different if we did not know the past, but we knew the whole future ahead of us? Wouldn't it be precisely the same as it is now, but then in a strange inversion, like living in a mirror image? Would this inversion perhaps, more easily lend itself to an understanding of all human experience as a kind of falling? Would we then see ourselves falling more clearly? And if we take this, the basic condition of kind of recursive self-referential consciousness for granted, then according to cognitive and computer scientist Joscha Bach, attention, short-term, long-term, biographical memory, all form a simulation of the agent's own regulation, the self again. So as Bach explains, open quote, this model is not the self, is not identical with the regulation, but allows the organism to explain, predict, and evaluate its own behavior, and thereby improving the regulation. The self model and the agent's current spatio-temporal limitations constitute an egocentric, local, perceptual space of the organism. The agent is also able to create counterfactual world states, like imagined or remembered mental states that don't conform to the present state of the environment or the self. This mental state is crucial for planning, learning, and reasoning, of course. End quote. Without this spatialized map, perceptual chaos would ensue, as in William James's description of what young infants probably undergo, like a kaleidoscopic experience, and as we observe also in agents who lack specific parts of the brain or suffer from conditions such as depersonalization or schizophrenia, something that predictive processing scholar Carl Friston has dealt with at length, if you're interested in that. So going down a few levels below cells to, let's say, unicellular organisms, a bacterium's DNA structure undergoes changes, and if the mutation happens to provide an advantage in its capacity to respond to the environment and endure, the organism is reborn under a previously disadvantageous spatial constraint, which has now been answered to. So going back up a few levels, an organ, whether organic or simulated by organic beings, so as in a governmental structure, learns and specializes by inevitably developing models which answer to an ever larger diversity or specialization of spatial problems. The model can be said to be the organ itself, as it would be the case with a stomach or an adversarial network. Well, the affordance is that it engages with perceivable spatial configurations, and the traces that they define shape all future interactions that it may undergo. And at an even higher level, if we wish to continue with this hierarchical stacking, a person thinks by constantly reshuffling beliefs and motivations based on earlier input, of course. And in all three cases, the initial input is the environmental spatial configuration, information about which is imprinted by way of interaction and predictive modeling. And these effects prompt the agent to intuit its way around space, leading to the formation of habits, such as the effect of illusions. And this is when I want to share my screen. Let me see. Is it visible? Yeah. So the effects prompt the agent to intuit its way around space, and so we get the creation of the effects of illusions in beings such as ourselves, and this also leads to new habits, so the understanding of illusions as well. So the importance of grasping this, like I said earlier, of giving spatial intuition more elusive and a more space than it is often granted, is that is understanding that what we call rationality is much more elusive and intuitive than we often tend to assume. And let's take the inclining shepherd tables as an example, because you and I have perceived the optical effects of spatial depth a myriad of times. We see the left table as leaner and longer than the right table, but these two surfaces are in fact identical. The prediction that they are different emerges from an accumulation of habits over time. And your ability to expect objects to behave in a certain spatial manner toward your interest has been prompted by the many three-dimensional interactions that you had, where it was adequate to understand depth in such a way. So intuitive thought is amassed unconscious inference converging towards a decision. The affordances of the tables matter in your world, in your Umwelt, and it's inevitably both a decision and a reaction to the environment and the given somatic state of the agent. So it's a biased state of inclination. Bias is inclination, etymologically speaking. So repeating what has already been said, what evolutive cognitive cybernetic systems do is it eternally fall into place, right, by way of their inclinations or biases. The poetic catchphrase works on a few levels, like falling relates to the gravitational aspect I've been talking about, the physical inclination that inevitably constrains organisms. Into hints at the nature of their boundedness and self-referential recursive condition, and place relates to the affordances and restrictions of the environment. So spatial reasoning. So what does falling have to do with thinking and computation? If you follow this truckload of, let's be kinder and perhaps say semantic unravelings that I just presented, we can trace a metaphysics of preservation against gravity and thus entropy to larger or lesser extents. And in the end, however, of course, there is no beating gravity. All these predictive systems are inevitably evolving into decomposition. But these cybernetic recursions persistently insist on their boundedness by a limit, right? Wishing to maintain it, but inevitably wearing and tearing due to gravity. As Gilbert Simondon put it, becoming is a dimension of being corresponding to a capacity of being, to fall out of phase with itself, that is, to resolve itself by dephasing itself. All becomings, ourselves included, are systems which inevitably fall apart. I have no real conclusion here because this was just a speculative avenue for thinking about naturalistic determinism of thought and computation by way of the act of falling. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for your talk. Yes, you can. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much, Sonia, for your talk. And now I turn to Steve Battle. He's a computer scientist. Excuse me, Jonas, sorry, you are clapping your hands. Okay. Now I turn to Steve Battle. He's a computer scientist and with a background in artificial intelligence. He works at the University of West England in the Bristol Robotics Laboratory.
He's also a cat man, so I am a dog. My dog is not so happy. He's not so happy.
He's just decided to join me for the talk.
Yes.
Your cat is welcome. So, well, his talk is about robots with purpose. Please, Steve.
Thank you. And thank you, Sonia, for a great talk. I do have questions for you. I'll come back to later. Right. Can you see my screen? Good. Okay.
Yes.
So my talk is robots with purpose or purposeful robots. The talk changed title somewhere in the last year. So I'm interested in very simple robots that we can kind of use in thought experiments. So the simpler the robot, the better. So a kind of robot I like in particular is this little book by Valentino Breitenberg. So we call them Breitenberg vehicles. And you can see a couple of examples here. So I'm going to look at these two vehicles today. So they're called Vehicle 1 and Vehicle 2. And the Vehicle 1, it's the one on the left. It's got one eye and it's got one motor. And you can think of that as an electric motor that helps the thing get around. It's got a really simple neural network of kind of one nerve fiber running from its eye to the motor. So basically, the more light that comes in the front, the faster the motor goes. So we can use this as a very simple kind of experiment to ask, does this robot act with purpose? Can we use that word? I like to, a lot of my work is kind of about asking questions, what kinds of words can we use with machines, be it consciousness, intelligence? Those are quite problematic. So I tend to go to the simpler end of things like, cognition maybe, but purpose is kind of at the simple end. Can I use that word with a machine, a robot? And then we've got the machine on the right. It's got slightly more complexity. It's got two eyes, two motors, and a very simple brain where the connections cross over there, you can see in the diagram. And there at the bottom, I can't see because my cat's in the way, but the book is kind of interesting because it presents these robots in a kind of very stimulus response way of thinking about it. So, you know, a certain amount of light at the input will cause the motors to go at a certain speed. So you think, yeah, very straightforward stimulus response model. But Breitenberg also introduces them in this kind of very poetic manner. He talks about vehicle 2 there as being aggressive because it, given a light source, it will rush towards it in a kind of an aggressive manner. So it's kind of a challenge. It's kind of two ways of looking at the same system. Either as a simple machine, you know, we can see its brain there, it's very simple, or thinking in terms of what it does in the world. So I'm coming from a very kind of an embodied cognition stance, thinking about, you know, that what this robot does is basically what happens when you put it in a particular world. One way of thinking about these robots is that, you know, they're light sensors and electric motors, wheels, but these can also represent things that we find more commonly in nature. So vehicle 1 might be a very simple kind of bacterium like E. coli that can measure a kind of a chemical gradient in the water that it's in, and it's got a kind of a simple flagella at the back. If it spins it around, it moves forward, or it can tumble randomly. But the great things about these vehicles, you can also build them out of Lego as well. So they're great fun, great things to do in classes with kids. So we can get kids to build simple robots. And I think philosophy does inform the way we build these systems. I always like to kind of uncover the kind of philosophical underpinnings of these things. So, you know, if we're thinking about purpose, can we use that word? It goes back to Aristotle and his idea of telos, which is the kind of the purpose of a thing. But later on, kind of Kant came up with a more kind of reasonable worldview. He talks about effectively what we call circular causality. So the quote is, don't want him to cut me off. So Kant says that a thing exists as a natural end if it is a cause and effect of itself. So systems can create themselves. So it's like Sonia was saying about very simple organisms can basically build themselves. They're their own cause. And they create their own purpose in the world as well. So that idea is effectively, that is cybernetics, that things existing as causes and effects of themselves. And a famous cyberneticist, Stafford Beer, he's famous for this quote that the purpose of a system is what it does, or posywid. It's quite a, you know, I don't like it as a phrase, because that would also include things falling. So a rock rolling down a hill, falling down a hill. I don't see that as a goal-seeking activity. It's just kind of rolling to the bottom, and it'll stay there at the bottom. Whereas I see goal-seeking behavior in organisms as they're achieving low entropy or unlikely states. So they're trying to achieve some goal which wouldn't be achieved if you just let the kind of the thermodynamic process kind of you know, unfold, as it were. So from this perspective, organisms are in the business of control. And that's either control of their form, kind of forming themselves physically, or once they exist, of controlling the environment they're in. So basically, they want to move to an area where there's food. That's something that's about controlling what it sees. So it's control of perception. So it wants to move to a place where it can detect high concentrations of food. So it's not about prediction. It's kind of interesting. This is kind of seems at odds with Carl Friston approach, and it's not about inference. It's simply about control. So this is where conceptual control theory came about. This is invented by a guy called Bill Powers, or William Powers. He wrote a book in 1973, The Control of Perception.
he kind of, described perceptual control theory as effectively, what if we apply control theory, which was he learned from an engineering background, to the description of organisms. Let's see how that works, and it seems to work quite well. And if we look at the neurology of organisms, we can also see similar circuits that would be predicted by perceptual control theory in the brain. But an interesting precursor of PCT is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He always gets there first. So he describes the quote here: motor devices, so the motors, appear as the means of re-establishing an equilibrium, the conditions of which are given in the sensory sector of the nervous system. So he's saying that, again, an organism is trying to control its perceptions. So the conditions are given in the senses. It's trying to achieve a certain perception. Another great thing about this perceptual control theory, it's got a nice, simple methodology. So what I'm trying to get towards is actually applying this as an experimental technique, in effect, robo-psychology, applying that to robots. And the simple methodology we're going to apply here is to develop a hypothesis about what we think it is that the robot or the vehicle is controlling, and then allow that system to find its equilibrium, and then kind of record that goal variable. So if we think this thing is moving towards the light, we could measure, how much light is this robot picking up where it is at equilibrium. And then we introduce this disturbance. We try to basically get in the way of this thing achieving or maintaining its goal. So if we think this little vehicle is trying to maximize the amount of light it receives, we can basically put a screen in the way or change the amount of light that's coming off this object that it's trying to find. And we see how it tries to get around that. So we basically try to stop it rolling or falling down, then see, can it counteract that? Can it get around this disturbance or obstacle? And if it does, then we can say, yeah, it looks like it's controlling for that variable. And we can do that quantitatively by measuring correlation or error. So I've got two experiments that will, for each of these vehicles, that will show that. If you want to run these on your phone, there's a little URL at the bottom, go.ue.ac.uk/V1. So that's you can run that on your phone. It's just a simulation in processing of vehicle 1, so you can actually see the behavior for yourself rather than me show a video. And you get a picture that you can see, so a little cartoon picture of vehicle 1 there. What Breitenberg also puts in his book is that vehicle 1, because it's so simple, it's in an environment like kind of a bacterium. Once it encounters kind of water particles, there's going to be a lot of noise. So this thing will be buffeted around. So it will be pushed around by basically Brownian motion. So that's built into the simulation as well. So the angle or the heading of this vehicle is completely random. These vehicles have got simple eyes. Breitenberg kind of doesn't say much about them, he just says they're eyes. So it's up to us when we're building simulations to kind of come up with an interpretation of that. So I've used the basic idea, it's called Lambert's cosine law, so that it's the same way that if you tilt photocells or solar panels towards the sun to get the most energy. So if the light source is dead on, you get the most energy coming in. And if you rotate it, the energy falls off according to the cosine of the angle. And if the sun is behind your solar panel or photocell, there's no light coming in at all. So it's a kind of a hard cutoff if something goes behind. So that's why we've got kind of a cosine here in the diagram to the right, and it's cut off so you can't see things behind it, or there's no energy from any light coming in behind. So this eye is kind of acting a bit like a kind of a decision box. So it will move forward if the light's ahead of it, and it will stop if the light's gone behind it. So it will basically move towards the light and then it will stop if it's gone just beyond it. So we might surmise that this thing will try to minimize the distance between itself and the light. So the disturbance we introduce could be to basically move a light source around and see if it follows it. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm basically going to add a sinusoid to the horizontal position of a light source. And if we do that, not going to go through that. That's just kind of the correlation coefficient, get a correlation of 0.9, which is really high. Normally, if it's above 0.5, you accept it as valid. So there's a high degree of correlation, so we accept the hypothesis that it's trying to minimize the distance between itself and the light source. Vehicle 2, so here's the second experiment. Again, there's a simulation of vehicle 2. So if you go to go.ue.ac.uk/v2, so this vehicle is the one that's got 2 eyes, 2 motors, and a very simple crossover brain. Interestingly, like our own brain, we've got a kind of this crossover. You know, all the neurons from your left eye go to the right side of your brain, and vice versa. To make this one work, it's got slightly more complicated eyes. Again, it's the cosine law, but it's got wraparound vision. So if an object goes behind it, it can still see it, but it gives a negative signal for that. So it's got the full cosine for each eye. The 2 eyes are mounted 90 degrees against each other, so that one gives a cosine wave, the other one gives a sine wave. And that gives us nice, interesting properties if you've got a cosine and a sine wave. If you kind of add them and subtract them, you get different properties. So dead ahead would be that point there, kind of where it says dead ahead at pi/4. So when the light source is dead ahead, it's going to get kind of equal light coming to both eyes, so it will go straight forward. So it will kind of do this aggressive move running towards the light source. But there are other kind of stable points here. If we kind of move 90 degrees either way, the values balance out. So the cosine is equal to the minus of the sine wave. So we'd expect interesting effects there. So it might be, so what are these other stable equilibria in this system? And these might correspond to states that it's purposefully trying to achieve. So here's my robo-psychology experiment 2. It could be controlling for brightness. So it's clearly going towards the light source, but it might also be, it might also favor situations where the light is at 90 degrees to the left or right of it. And this is a bit like the moth dorsal light reaction, you know, where the way moths fly around lampposts, it's because they're trying to keep, they think they're keeping the moon above it. So they want to stay 90 degrees to the moon. So it could be that this robot has a similar reaction to that. So I call that the dorsal light reaction. The disturbance I'm going to introduce here is to vary the luminosity of the light source at the center of its world. So it could be that as the sun dims, it will kind of gradually fall into the center. But that wouldn't happen if it's controlling for the angle. It would stay at a constant kind of orbital speed. So, you know, even though I created this simulation, I didn't actually know what it would do. So the results are surprising to me as the kind of the author of these things. So that's the kind of the results. So basically, gradually turn down the luminosity of the light source, and we record the brightness and the angle in each of those positions. And in this case, I'm not doing correlation, I'm working out what's the error signal. So, and what's the error between kind of what we think is its reference goal, what is it trying to achieve, the value we recorded right at the beginning when it was at equilibrium. And we can see here that the after normalization, there's an error of kind of, well, the numbers don't make any sense, but we can see it's kind of 2 magnitudes of difference between brightness and angle. So there's much lower error in the angle. So we can say, we can reject hypothesis 2 that it's controlling for brightness. We can say it's controlling for angle. So that's its purpose. So my conclusions are that vehicle one, I'm saying we can use the word purpose here, and its purpose is to kind of minimize distance, to home in on the light source. And vehicle two, its purpose is to control its angle to the light source. It's using the dorsal light reaction. So it's not, we don't see it kind of falling into the sun as the sun gets dimmer. Yeah, that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your talk. And now I think we can open the debate, 10 minutes. Then we will have again a short break. And then at 4 p.m. we will resume the session with a general discussion. So are there questions for Sonia and Steve? Sonia, please.
I have an immediate question for Steve. Thank you so much. That was really nice. I was wondering more, so at the beginning of your talk, like this relates to mine, I was thinking, so if you don't think that control is an inference or a prediction, then how would you define control? Because what I think then the robot is doing, it's like, you know, it's undergoing this feedback mechanism by which it controls for angle, because it knows indeed what, or it knows, however we might want to call that, it's doing something with the knowledge about what the angle should be, and it maintains a certain equilibrium, which I would call a prediction. But you were saying that control is not a prediction, not an inference. So I was wondering if you can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, okay, so a control is primarily an action in the world. So you're trying to minimize an error between a desired state and an actual state. Whereas prediction is something that would happen kind of in some hypothetical or mystical mental world. But you know, yeah, I'm coming from this embodied tradition where what counts is what happens in the world, and we can see that as a control process. I'm really interested in, so how would you square that with Carl Fristen's kind of predictive work? Maybe there is some kind of unification there.
I think, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what you just defined as the control for error, the prediction of error, the you know, like the minimization of error, that would be in predictive processing what a prediction is, and like it's a kind of unconscious inference. It's not necessarily in the sense of like what we maybe more in everyday language refer to as prediction, where you have a longer term plan and a kind of, let's say, higher order cognitive state. It's really just the state you want to be at and the state that you are at, that the difference between that is the prediction that you make. But we can get into that maybe.
Yeah. But for PCT, the theory, if there's any prediction happening, that will be secondary. You know, it will be there to help control. Control is the primary thing that it's doing.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Steve. And now Daniel Trujillo. I hope.
Hi, I enjoyed. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I enjoyed both the presentations very much. So I'm a PhD candidate at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and I look at the practical application of ethics to robotic systems with an emphasis on autonomous weapon systems. And I guess, so my question is applicable to both of your presentations, but I would first direct it at Sonia. You described the idea of falling and used it as a metaphor, and I guess what going beyond the metaphor, or metaphorically speaking of falling, what I'm curious to hear your thoughts about is the idea or the disconnect between embodied and disembodied systems, because I think one of the logical conclusions that I take from this idea of you need to understand falling, if you actually think of it physically, as opposed to just metaphorically, there's a need for an embodiment for this cognition. And I think it's really interesting because there's a huge disconnect in the discussions between pure software systems like artificial intelligence that is disembodied and embodied systems that are in the form of robotics that rely on algorithms for their purpose. And I guess to tie that into what Steve was just talking about, and perhaps Steve, you can comment as well. Do you think that there needs to be an embodiment, like you're doing the work on the robotics, in order to have a purpose? Or can there be a pure software system that also has a purpose and is not manifesting in a physical form? So I guess that's where I'm getting at. And this is important for the research I'm doing as well, because the question that we run into is you're starting to see somewhat or semi-autonomous cyber weapons that have some, you could say, some form of autonomy, or that are reacting faster than humans could direct them, but they're not embodied in as an autonomous weapon system in a robotic form. So that's where this is coming from.
If I may just take it quickly and then actually pass it over to Steve, because he will have more interesting things to say about this, but just to I'm sure. Just to answer to the beginning of what you mentioned, I think it's very difficult to say that you can have embodied and disembodied, systems. I think that's one of the main focuses of what I'm trying to get at with the idea of falling. That it's a way of really bringing attention to the kind of materialist substrate that you actually do not have. And this is something that Kittler also says, Friedrich Kittler, who was mentioned before. There is no disembodied possibility. There is no, everything is functioning on some kind of substrate. So that would be like a kind of my initial answer to that. And then yeah, I wanted to say something else, but maybe it's good for the larger discussion. So I'll pass it over to Steve for the robotics part.
Yeah, so I think it is possible to have a software robot, a control system within a software system. We see plenty of examples of that. Virus throttling is one example. Would be kind of you controlling the amount of traffic to cut, stop viruses communicating back to their core base. So yeah, software robots are absolutely a valid thing. So the software world is their actual world. It's kind of, I don't know, but Sonia was kind of alluding to physical systems in terms of maybe, when you think about autopoiesis, I always think of that as a necessarily physical system. So I don't like it when people talk about software autopoietic systems. It just doesn't feel right to me. I think that's all about systems creating themselves physically in the physical world, making their own parts. So I think there's only kind of so far we can go with software robots. I think physical robots kind of have more mileage and kind of throw out more surprises as well.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Daniel, have you got any other questions for Steve or?
No, I know. I think, that's great. I appreciated the answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think we will meet here in 10 minutes again for a general discussion and closing remarks. Okay, so we will meet again here at 4 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.
3 o'clock.
Oh, sorry, 2 o'clock.
Oh yeah, you're yeah.
Sonia, I can see you. I think we have to wait just for a few seconds.
No problem.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Hi, Katerina. Well, in the meantime, for Steve and Daniel, there is a text in the chat box Jacqueline Bellon. With regard to disembodied AI or concerning the topic of software purpose, I can recommend a paper. She sent you a link in the chat box. So she recommends a paper. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
It seems Jacqueline is still here, probably she's away.
Hi, no, I'm here. I'm just not
okay.
on camera. I hear you. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much for your suggestion. Well, it seems that we finish with our talk session because, as you know, two of our participants yesterday sent us an email, and unfortunately they are not here due to coronavirus. Really, they are in remission, and I hope they will get soon well. Well, first of all, let me thank you for taking part in animating this session of our Philosophy After Artificial Intelligence Symposium. From your talks, I think we can work on about a lot of theoretical questions, and these questions really, in my opinion, recall talks that have been held in the other edition, in the previous two editions of our Philosophy After AI Symposium, because in the previous editions of this kind of symposium, we talk about the mind-body problem, the relationship between action and language, and so on. And but before opening this general discussion, I want to thank the organization of AISB convention for the effort they made to put together this annual appointment besides the coronavirus. So thank you very much. I see here Rob. So Rob, thank you very much for your effort. And Yasmin, but she is not here, but I will thank her then. I think we can open our general discussion. So we have a lot of time, and I have some questions, but I don't want to start and to hide the other participants. So I don't know if there are questions about the talks or more general things. Well, I think I can start. I start from Jonas. I think I can go. I can follow the order of the talk. Well, Jonas, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. And in my opinion, your contribution is very interesting. When you speak about AI as a toolbox and about philosophy as a discussion partner, because in my opinion, what lacks the research relationship between philosophy and AI is that philosophy sometimes is not seen as a partner. So it seems to me that your contributions seeks to manage a philosophical vision of AI overall in terms of research methodology. And so I appreciate this very much. But I have a little question. At the end of your talk, you mentioned ethics and philosophy of information. So I want to know, in your path, in the path that you have outlined, what is the possible role of ethics and philosophy of information?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and thanks for having me and for organizing this great event. Well, I think the expectations shouldn't be too high and they shouldn't be too low, because if they are too high, there might be a philosophy winter within the AI field, so to speak, and nobody will pay attention anymore to philosophers if the expectations directed towards ethicists and philosophers are too high. And of course, there are utilitarians, Aristotelians, Kantians, and nobody, there's still great discussion about what is the right answer to the trolley problem, for instance. And I think we need open discussion, and not just amongst academics, philosophers, AI researchers, and other academics, but also it's important to get the public involved at some stage. So of course, is that what you were aiming at in that regard? Sometimes I get the feeling that AI researchers just think, okay, let the ethicists come in and then we solve the trolley problem and then everything is done. But I think it's just more complex, the whole story, and therefore, active discussion seems to be crucial. Does it make sense and answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much, Jonas. I think Steve has a question for.
I was just responding to Jonas there, that speaking as a computer scientist, I don't find computer science at all helpful in helping me think about AI. It's kind of led us up, so many garden paths in terms of kind of using representations. Representations and computation go together. So I do find philosophy much more informing and useful when I'm thinking about AI today. So yeah.
Thanks.
Study philosophy, not computer science.
Even
study both.
In your talk, you used philosophy as a discussion partner, as I suggested, like Merleau-Ponty, right? So you're already living the vision, as it were.
And that point kind of relates also to the prediction control debate. I think that if we think about, I think computation is also like an act of falling. It's a thermodynamic process, and in that way, if I don't see that, computation, because it's not useful in thinking about cognition or intelligence, I have my doubts about predictive processing. Maybe the prediction control thing can be resolved if you think of them as opposite sides of the same coin, so that if the brain does kind of internally some kind of computation or prediction, but in the world it's doing control, then they're almost like the same things but duals of each other. But I'm just more interested in, what does this machine do in the world? I don't really believe that I'm conscious. I think the brain is just like a liver. It's not conscious. It can be completely replaced by a computer and I wouldn't notice.
I would love to answer to that, but Katerina has a hand up also.
It was just a follow-up on the discussion before, not just, so the question is not just for Jonas, but maybe for all of us. If we think that finally with AI and with the research that philosophers and computer scientists, ethicists, and other people are doing on AI, we can finally reach this interdisciplinarity that everybody's talking about, that I don't think anybody is capable of doing. Is that an opportunity, do you think, for all of us?
I think so, yeah. These things take time. I think we're just like, the conversation is emerging now because we're realizing like, a lot of specialization actually leads to quite narrow roads that that of course it's necessary to specialize, but if you do it too much, then, so I think that's why the transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity discussion is emerging now, and there's already a lot of programs that are really open to inviting all sorts of disciplines. And I mean, I think this panel is already like this conversation is already quite the example if, in that sense. But I think it's, yeah, for like as a human project, let's say, like if we zoom out of history and we look at the development of AI as, you know, the attempt at mimicking what we know to be the most basic thing we do, which is just thinking, existing, right, acting in the world, it cannot but be interdisciplinary because it's going to encompass everything. So it's, yeah, it's really I hope it's just this wonderful new opportunity that does lead to a lot of collaborations and not domination by one particular discipline over others, which is, yeah, if we look at Silicon Valley, what sometimes rather unfortunate domination happening there.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Katerina, and Steve and Jonas. Are there any other questions? Well, I think I have I have a question or a suggestion. I don't know how to categorize it. And it's about creativity. Because it seems to me that creativity is a sort of aspect which I can find in all your talks, because it is very difficult to give an univocal meaning of creativity, because we can consider creativity and the term creativity in a lot of ways. For example, about Sonia's talk, I was very interested in prediction, because the question should be, or could be, what is the relationship between improvisation and prediction? Because it is, in my opinion, a very huge question. And this kind of question is connected to Katerina's talk in a somewhat sense. And I was thinking about the books of Tullio De Mauro, who is an Italian linguist. And I think you have never heard about him, especially Sonia. I think that probably Katerina knows, obviously, Tullio De Mauro. And Claudia Stancati and I wrote an article which was published in the Italian Journal of Philosophy of Language. And then I will put the link here in the chat box, just for saying something about a kind of linguistic creativity. But I think that all the talks are linked in artistic creativity. Because let's consider dance. A year ago, the last year, in January, I watched a TV show on Italian television, and there was a famous Italian dancer. His name is Roberto Bolle. He was dancing with a machine. So there was an artistic performance, and we have a human agent, he's the dancer, Roberto Bolle, and an artificial agent. We can consider in this kind of performance a sort of creativity, which is the relevance of improvisation. Because if we consider dance, for example, tango, we can consider the role and the relevance of improvisation. And so when I watched on Italian TV this kind of artistic performance between a human and an artificial agent, I was shocked in a somewhat sense, because I had a lot of questions. Because I have questions, because creativity generally applies to humans, to human beings. And if we want to apply creativity to artificial agent, I think I don't know. I am just wondering if we have to think about creativity by levels, starting from a basic one to a more complex one. Or the other possibility, the other chance is to limit the attribution of creativity only to humans. But the real thing is what creativity is. Because if it is linked in a somewhat sense to improvisation, I think that it's very, very difficult to work only also on artificial agent besides machine learning and so on. I don't know what are your opinion about that. I am concerned about that. I am thinking about that for my researches, and I think this is my theoretical issue.
I have an answer to that, but Steve had a hand raised first.
Yes,
go for it.
Yeah, okay, so I'll approach your question from an embodied perspective. And so I'll ask the question, can humans create art? Or is it human culture? And if machines can engage within the human culture, then they can be just as creative as us. So I don't see that there's any bar to machines being creative. No, it's kind of a constructivism, a socially constructive perspective, so that art is created. What is the performer without the audience as well? Are they performing at all? Yeah, so an embodied socially constructive perspective. That's my point of view.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was gonna go along the same lines, kind of mentioning if we look at the history of art and the development of, let's say, painting as something that was supposed to be a true to nature engagement, where you really try to get, an imitation of what you're seeing perceptually on canvas. And then you look at the development of art in the 20th century, or like the end of the 19th century, and the sort of transition into also, practices of kind of combinatorics like Dadaism, and producing sort of these instant poems by kind of aleatory, like random processes, and also the whole history of like random processes in the flux movement, like John Cage and those types of people. That's, in a way, I don't think that that we can say it's different to leave something up to chance, in a sense, or like to ask a machine to produce something. If we look at the Google Deep Dream images, they're incredible, and like we made them, but it's also something that just emerged out of a process that is inaccessible to you experientially. But it's difficult to say. I think it's a question of legitimacy. It's a political question ultimately, to say like whether something is creative or not. It's like whether you granted the capacity to be considered somewhat of an equal to your capacities or not. So I think I would go completely with what Steve said. If we consider art, if people are granted the possibility to say like, look at this is art, then so is it also the same? It's the possibility to look at machines in the same way. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both. Katerina, I see
Yes.
your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And well, what I'm dealing with at the moment is exactly this question. So whether it is possible to define machines creative, or if creativity is something that is to an anthropic character, and that we will not be able to attribute to machines. But so from the results also that I got from this survey tend to go into this direction. So not only gaining intentionality, context sensitivity, or all these other human attributes won't be enough for us to consider machines creative, because we, in a sense, it's like granting that machines can be creative is like giving what is one of the key, one of the core features of humanity, giving it to machines. Yes, most people are struggling to do that. But I wonder if things would be different if instead of artistic creativity, we talk about scientific creativity. So like in the case of now with AlphaFold, for example, are we more prone to consider it creative because it's not art? So where is anthropomorphism, more in creativity or more in the concept of art?
Katerina, thank you. It seems a good point. And so how can I say, I agree with your question, because this is an issue that we probably should consider more in depth. Claudia and I considered the question about scientific creativity, but I think that we need more data to, how can I say, to have just a more accurate conclusion. I've seen a hand raised.
Jacqueline, I think.
Jacqueline. Oh, okay. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi. I just wanted to jump in with regard to art and the question of machine creativity. I've been following like machine algorithmic artists. There are some pretty good ones, and they describe the process of how they manipulate or adjust certain parameters in their model to get a certain outcome. And the outcome in the end is a generated picture or something else, some kind of piece of art. And it looks to someone who doesn't know how it has been produced like something the machine made. But when you listen to the people handling the machine, then you understand there's a lot more to it. And there are many, many levels where the human who does that still manipulates parameters. So I don't think we can say a machine is creative. The machine doesn't, it does something, but the idea to use it as a tool is the human idea to do that. So the creativity comes from the person who builds a model to do art or something like that. Maybe, I don't know. I just want I don't trust to say stuff like machines have creativity, to ascribe that kind of potential to them, because that you forget that it's a tool that human uses. That's what I wanted to say.
But also the question would be maybe like, do humans even have creativity? Because we are kind of natural born imitators who, you know, even the sounds that we're making right now are just, it's just a convention you got passed down, someone else got the same convention passed down. And it of course gets transformed by different contingent factors, but it's difficult to say, I think that you know, we know this quality, we know what it is, and only humans have it. Because it's, you know, it's a kind of what we're also doing when we're being creative, especially in improvisation, is a sort of combinatorics of sorts, right? You're really doing not like a completely new thing that has never happened before. You're just taking bits and pieces from things that you know, and all of that is a process, of course, of combining previously experienced things. Jonas, sorry.
Jonas?
Yeah, and I mean, some AI systems even transform fields or mental spaces, as Bowden would call it, and show transformative creativity. For instance, AlphaGo has changed the whole, how even humans play Go. And I mean, all Go players were impressed and surprised by all the moves made by AlphaGo, and it has completely changed the whole game and how professional Go players approach playing Go and actually play the game. So, I mean, machines therefore can also have an impact on human creativity, so to speak.
Yeah. If I can riff off of that, it's like also just to remind of the trope in AI research that is often brought up about, you know, AI is whatever AI hasn't accomplished yet. So every time that something new gets accomplished, like for example, beating a world Go champion, then it's like, oh, but that's not AI, you know, that's just a very complicated, whatever, decision process. And you know, creativity might be one of those next flagpoles that we in a few years are like, well, obviously machines can be creative because look at this and look at that, but we kind of keep expanding the border, right? That's the context of discovery, of how, you know, by saying something is not something, then you're like, well, but what is it really? And you kind of keep advancing. I think that's the beauty of the whole project of AI, no?
Thank you, Sonia. Are there any other questions, ideas, issues that you want to raise?
I had a joke that I was reminded of with Steve's presentation. So if it's fun to introduce a joke in the middle of the talk, I will tell it. It's like, so there is a moth flying around, and then the moth goes into doctor's office and sits down and starts telling the doctor, "Doctor, my life is at an impasse. I'm, you know, my wife left me, my children, they don't want to see me anymore, and I started drinking. I picked up drinking again, and I really don't. I don't know what to do. It's really I'm at a loss, and I'm thinking of ending things." It's like, whoa. The doctor is like, calm down. What's going on? I feel you, but I'm just a pediatrician. I don't know how I can help you. This is more a question for a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Why did you come to me? And then Moth is like, I don't know, the light was on. Speaking of creativity and making decisions, right? I think that's very often what we do as humans, right? That we think we're making certain kinds of very specific decisions, and actually we're just following the light.
Yes, thank you, Sonia, for this joke. It was very funny, but very interesting about our human behavior.
So I would many thanks to all the participants to the symposium. Looking at this symposium from a general point of view, we are every year deeper in philosophy and deeper in artificial intelligence problems. And I think that now the point for, I hope, next year is the kind of symbolism and symbolic relationship that we use. This is a point very important, very interesting, because there is a sort of symbol that are in a semiotic tradition, and symbolic is also in logical and philosophical tradition. And so comparing the two traditions of symbolic thought, semiotic one and logical one, I think can be an interesting point of view. Another discussion about philosophy and after in artificial intelligence, I think. So, Giusy, what do you think? And the other participants, what do you think about?
Well, your suggestion recalls me the semiotician research made in Italy by Umberto Eco, and the relationship between science, kind of science, and cybernetics and theory of information during the 60s. But probably we can think about another symposium probably next year, trying to define the relationship between kind of symbolism and giving space to neuro symbolism, and trying to understand in philosophy the relationship, the kind of relationship between that could be if we think about philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. And so I don't know, probably we can go ahead following this path, but it seems to me that each year we try to change the focus of our symposium, but really we return to, at the end of the day, to more general philosophical questions. And in my opinion, this is very interesting because we try to focus on a point, and it seems that then we have some step back and we watch the whole picture. So it is very, very interesting and goes in the direction, it is a similar perspective about, I think Sonia or Steve said, study philosophy.
Yes.
I think that this is an interesting theme for, and I think it's nice to be set a challenge for next year. You know, from an embodied perspective, it's a complete mystery as to how symbols emerge, and that's kind of the holy grail for us now. So trying to get away from the old-fashioned AI way of doing symbols in the computer as to how do symbols emerge in the world. Yeah, but whether we can solve that in the year, I don't know.
So Kant e l'ornitorinco by Eco, written by Eco at the end.
Yes, it is Kant and the octopus.
Octopus,
The platypus, no?
No, platypus, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Platypus, yes.
Almost.
Another thing.
Also a very
Sorry,
interesting animal.
platypus,
But...
yes. Yes, Kant and the platypus. So how you can recognize a thing that you see in that you experience in your life, in your everyday life, like a bottle or a, how can I say, something, a pen or something like that, and which kind of relationship there is with language and other kind of signs.
And imagination schemes is the focus of imagination schemes. And so Sonia, or I don't know, or Steve spoke about critica del giudizio, Kant's.
Kant, yes, about Kant.
Yes, about
Someone
Kant.
mentioned Kant.
Scheme of imagination is the first step of a symbolic and semiotic way of reasoning, and I think it is just a point, an interesting point for starting point for next year, I hope.
It seems to me that is becoming a very big issue. I don't know. I don't know if we can make this kind of work, this big, huge work, just for one symposium. Probably we have to split our work in more years. I don't know, but yes, I think we can start I think we can start thinking about meeting next year, I hope. Well, are there other things, questions, ideas? Well, okay, it seems we have done with our work now. And I just want to remember you that at 5 p.m. There is the plenary talk of Professor Peter Robinson, and you can access to the plenary talk at the previous windows. So it was the previous access point. Well, so I want to thank you all again for joining us to the third edition of the Philosophy After AI Symposium. And I hope we will meet next year, or we can email each other just to increase our network and our researches. So thank you very much again, and thank you very much again to the AISB organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Giusy and
Thank
Claudia.
you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Very much.
Next year in
Probably face to face.
Face to face, yeah. Embodied.
embodied.
I like Zoom. I like Zoom.
Yes, it's a very good joke. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you.
Take care. See you later.
Bye-bye, take care too.
Thanks,
Bye-bye, bye-bye.